Rasmussen's argument from limits, which is interesting. Whatever's limited has an explanation. If whatever's limited has an explanation, possibly something's unlimited, so something is unlimited, possibly. If something's unlimited, then it's perfect. If something is perfect, it's necessary. So it follows that if something is unlimited, it's necessary. And then we have the crucial step from S5 that gives us our conclusion. There is something that's perfect and necessary.
So I have various responses. So here's response number 1. It's not clear to me why we should accept premise 1 as opposed to accepting, say, a PSR as restricted to simply contingent things. Not necessarily limited things, but just a PSR restricted to contingent things, which would allow for a foundational necessary thing that's limited in various ways. So that's one way that I would respond. It's just not clear to me that whatever is limited has an explanation. I would probably only go so far as to say that whatever is contingent requires an explanation, which would allow for there to be a necessary limited thing. Now, you could, of course, say in response to me there that explanation, Joe, is the norm, and so positing a break in that uniformity would require some principled reason. Now, that's a potentially plausible response, but then I'm just thinking about the whole of my evidence base. In that case, I could, in principle, grant the rest of the argument and then mount, as a principled reason, any argument for naturalism or against theism. Because if you're just saying that, hey, explanation is a norm, and so we should have some defeasible presumption against positing a break in that uniformity, well, then that defeasible presumption is going to have to carry through here. So you're not going to be able to get that there is something that is perfect and necessary. That's not the conclusion that you can get to. The conclusion that you can get to is that there's a defeasible presumption in favor of thinking that there is something that's perfect and necessary. But of course, that's highly defeasible, and any principled reason that you could offer in favor of naturalism or against theism would potentially serve as something that counteracts that support or justification. So that's one thing that I would say. It's just limiting, if you will pardon the pun, it's limiting the degree of confidence that we should have in this kind of argument as an argument for God's existence. Response number 2, I would say premise 2 here is questionable. If whatever is limited has an explanation, then possibly something is unlimited. What I say is, in principle, it could be the case that every limited thing has an explanation, while something unlimited is impossible. Perhaps every contingent limited thing is ultimately explained in terms of a necessary limited thing, and the necessary limited thing is explained in terms of the metaphysical necessity of its existence, or equivalently, the metaphysical impossibility of its non-existence. Of course, I know Josh has various things to say on this, and I have various things to say in response, and he and I have gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth in lots and lots and lots of email exchanges over the years. So, of course, I'm not saying that Josh is unaware of this kind of response. Josh and I have gone, anyway, we both have gone back and forth a lot on this argument. I'm just articulating some of the worries that I have for it. I'm not saying, of course, that they are final or that they are knocked down or anything like that. Inquiry continues. But my point here is just that premise 2, I think, is questionable. Again, it could be the case that everything limited has an explanation because every contingent limited thing has an explanation in terms of something necessary that's limited, and then that necessary limited thing would be explained in terms of the metaphysical impossibility of its non-existence. And in that case, everything would be limited despite the fact that whatever is limited has an explanation. So you wouldn't be able to conclude that possibly something is unlimited. Okay, response number 3. I would say that premise 4 is implausible by my lights. I think something could be unlimited and yet nowhere near perfect. Perhaps it has simply no axiological properties whatsoever. So no properties like goodness or badness or things like that. And in that case, it could be, quote-unquote, unlimited with respect to its value or with respect to its goodness, but it would be unlimited in that respect simply because it is not the case that it has some limited degree of value or goodness or whatever. It's just the kind of thing to which value and goodness don't even apply. Similar to how God doesn't have any spatial limits, simply because he's not a spatial being. Of course, some people think that God is a spatial being, but set that aside. God isn't limited spatially, and the reason for that is because spatial properties don't even apply to God. So it's not as though God has some degree or extent of spatiality, and that degree or extent is limited. No, rather, such properties don't even apply to God. And similarly, something could be unlimited in principle, it seems to me, and yet nowhere near perfect because perhaps it simply has no axiological properties, and it's just not the kind of thing to which axiological properties would attach. Perhaps like something like the foundational universal wave function or quantum field. Moreover, we can suppose then that it still lacks spatial and temporal boundaries. If it's a quantum field, maybe it's like an everywhere present quantum field. Maybe it's the universal wave function, which functionally realizes the whole of space-time itself, so it's not restricted to a particular spatial location or particular temporal location. Alternatively, if it's something within space-time, it could be in some sense, quote-unquote, omnispatial and omnitemporal. So it could just be, again, something like a quantum field, which doesn't have any particular boundaries on it, but it just extends to all of space and throughout all of time. And so we could even have a spatiotemporal object, which is not limited even in those senses. So my point is just that I'm actually quite skeptical that you can infer perfect from unlimited, because maybe lots of the properties that like apply to God, it's not as though we're saying that it has like, oh yeah, it has some knowledge, but it's like a super duper limited degree of knowledge, or those sorts of things, or it has some value, or it has some goodness, but just a super duper limited degree. No, those sorts of properties aren't even applicable to it, and yet it's still unlimited in the various properties that are applicable to it, like spatial extent or temporal extent or whatever. So that's the third response that I level. The fourth response that I want to level is a problem. Arguably, God, or at least the Christian God, cannot be unlimited. This seems to infer that something is unlimited, and the idea is that this unlimited thing is God. But of course, the Christian God, I argue, cannot be unlimited. So first, the problem of Trinitarianism. So to be Trinitarian is to be limited in a certain respect. One is limited in one's number of persons. It's not 2, it's not 4, it's not 250, it's not infinitely many, it's exactly 3. And so God isn't, after all, unlimited if God is Trinitarian. Now, of course, one response that you're probably going to give, and one response that Josh himself gives, is that, oh, well, the foundational being simply can't have fundamental limits. It can have non-fundamental aspects or properties or features or respects in which it is limited in various ways. So it can have various non-fundamental limited aspects or properties or features and so on. It's just that those limits must be explained by or dependent upon or grounded in more fundamental features or aspects of the foundational being, and those fundamental features will be unlimited. But by my lights, that response is seriously problematic for several reasons. The first reason why that response is seriously problematic is that how are the persons then fully divine? Is aseity not a divine attribute? Is it not an essential divine attribute? Plausibly, aseity is a perfection, and so the persons would then be lacking a perfection, and so not, after all, God. So the Trinitarian problem still remains. Now, why would I say that they'd be lacking perfection? Well, because this argument is saying that any of these limits are non-fundamental. They're grounded in some positive ontological item, some more fundamental layer of the foundation as a whole. But in that case, these various non-fundamental aspects, the Trinitarianhood of this being, the fact that it exists in 3 persons, that's going to be grounded in something more fundamental than the 3 persons. And so the fact that there are 3 persons, it seems, this limit would then be grounded. It would be non-fundamental. It wouldn't be a se. It would be dependent on something else within God. But then it's exceedingly difficult to see how the 3 persons are fully divine, because then they seem to be dependent realities. Here's another way to see this. For any x, if x is God, then x is fundamental. That seems plausible. God is that than which nothing is more fundamental. God is the fundamental ground of reality or whatever. God is by nature fundamental, and so anything that is God is also fundamental. Now the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Spirit is God. So each of the Father and the Son and the Spirit are fundamental. But if each of the Father, Son, and Spirit are fundamental, well then God's being Trinitarian is likewise fundamental, since God's being Trinitarian just is a matter of existing in these 3 persons, the Father, Son, and the Spirit. And so if these 3 persons are fundamental, so is God's Trinitarianhood. So it would follow that God's being Trinitarian is fundamental, which is, of course, incompatible with the response above. The response above that was just given says that no, actually, that limit, the fact that God is Trinitarian, God's Trinitarianhood, that's actually not fundamental, contrary to what we just derived. So that's my first response to this rejoinder, to the Trinitarian point. I would say, no, then that just seems to be incompatible with the persons being fully divine, which is what you need to affirm if you want to affirm Trinitarianism. Okay, what about the second response to this rejoinder, that it's fundamentally unlimited, but it can have non-fundamental limited properties or aspects or features or whatever? Well, my second response to that is, well, then you're probably going to have to say goodbye to the doctrine of divine simplicity as well. Well, then you're going to have to say goodbye to the doctrine of divine simplicity as well. At least, of course, for those who accept Trinitarianism. So Christians wouldn't be able to be accepting both the argument from limits and then the doctrine of divine simplicity. Because, again, the response in question requires there to be some more fundamental layer of God upon which the other limited aspects of God, like, for instance, God's being Trinitarian, depend. But then it is false, contra divine simplicity, that everything in God is God. Dependence relations within God among numerically distinct positive ontological items is simply debarred by divine simplicity. Now, of course, I'm okay with this, since I think there are lots of independent reasons to reject divine simplicity, and I know Josh Rasmussen likewise doesn't accept the traditional doctrine of divine simplicity as espoused by classical theism, but I just want to flag this as a problem for Trinitarian proponents of divine simplicity who are looking to employ the argument from limits. So that's my second response that points to its incompatibility with the doctrine of divine simplicity. When I say it, I mean the response to the Trinitarian point that makes a distinction between being fundamentally unlimited and being non-fundamentally limited. So that's my second response. My third response is that once you say that the foundation can be fundamentally unlimited but non-fundamentally limited, what I want to say then is then the naturalist can then say that the naturalistic foundation is limited in boatloads of respects, so long as they say that there are more fundamental aspects of the foundation which are unlimited, and which, in some way or another, explain its non-fundamental limits. And so then the argument here, the argument for limits, would then lose all of its force as an argument for theism. If to qualify as unlimited, you simply need to be fundamentally unlimited, but you can have various non-fundamental limited features and properties and so on, well then the naturalist can perfectly well accept that there is something unlimited, and it's not going to get you anywhere near something being perfect, because then it could be limited in boatloads of different respects, so long as those limited respects are explained in terms of a more fundamental layer of it, which is, let's say, just like thoroughly qualitative and unlimited. Now you might say, of course, that no, we're not saying that it can count as unlimited despite having limited non-fundamental aspects and unlimited foundational aspects. All we are concluding here is that there is something that's unlimited, and then we would just be referring to the fundamental layer of the foundational being as a whole, and that fundamental layer of the foundational being as a whole, even if it has a non-fundamental layer which is limited, that foundational layer is unlimited, and that's what we're referring to here. But again, that doesn't really help the argument, because then I'm still going to be rejecting premise 4 here. No, it wouldn't follow that if something is unlimited, then it's perfect, because again, you can have this naturalistically friendly unlimited thing, which is this unlimited fundamental layer of this naturalistic foundational being. This naturalistic foundational being is limited in whole concoctions of ways, whole boatloads of ways. It's just that it has some more fundamental layer which itself doesn't have limits. And again, that fundamental layer, that could be just, let's say, a qualitatively simple trope that doesn't have quantitative features or something like that. It could be something thoroughly unimpressive and nothing anywhere near perfect. I actually talk about seeds of these particular responses in my video, Contingency Arguments and the PSR with Elephant Philosophy. So this was in 2021. Wow, this is almost like a year and a half ago or something. But anyway, let's listen a little bit to this, because I think it'll be illuminating. This is on 1.5 times speed.
If we're saying that every limit is such that it can't be fundamental, then they're going to have to say, firstly, that being Trinitarian is not fundamental to God. That's already unintuitive. Secondly, it seems as though they have to, this is fine by me, but they're going to have to deny divine simplicity because you have a more fundamental layer of God that's somehow explanatorily undergirding this less fundamental layer of God. So you have these kinds of, that's obviously not compatible with divine simplicity. The third thing is that it seems as though the naturalist can then say, oh, well, the foundational reality is limited in a whole host of respects, but, fundamentally speaking, it's just unlimited, it's unlimited or it lacks certain limits, and that explains why it's limited in all these other regards, like perhaps it's spatially limited and it's super limited in its power, but, fundamentally speaking, it doesn't have limits and it explains those. And so, I don't know, it seems as though it gives kind of fodder for the naturalist, as it were. And then the fourth response I want to make to that is that, I don't know, it just seems to me that if the kind of being Trinitarian is not fundamental, I don't know, it's hard for me to see then how each of the persons are, or at least how each of the persons are divine, because surely Anyway,
I go on to articulate the problem that I have been articulating here, but like, look at this, my glasses were broken, so I had to put white tape on them. Oh my goodness, this is why I need your patron money, because I need to be able to afford glasses. I'm a lowly college student, so like, oh man, yes, if you want to give me a one-time donation, these are the sorts of things that you're helping me do, like just to fix these stupid little broken things that I'm not able to fix on my own. I have since fixed the glasses. Thankfully, I had some sort of warranty on them or whatever. Oh man, I probably look like such a moron walking around campus just with this, oh, I love it. The thing is, I really didn't care, and I still don't, which is just, I love it. Okay, anyway. So yeah, I'm leveling a bunch of different responses to the argument from limits, right? And our first response is that it's not clear why we should accept premise 1 as opposed to, say, PSR restricted to contingent things. My second response is that premise 2 is questionable because every limited thing could have an explanation despite the fact that it's not possible for there to be an unlimited thing. The third response was that premise 4 is implausible. By my light, something could be unlimited and yet nowhere near perfect. And then the fourth response that I'm giving is that God cannot be unlimited because of Trinitarianism. And then we're looking at Josh's response to that, which is, okay, the being simply can't have fundamental limits. It can have non-fundamental aspects that are limited, or it can have non-fundamental limits, but it just can't have fundamental limits. And then I'm leveling various responses to that. So the first one is that it doesn't seem as though the persons would then be fully divine. The second one is that you're getting rid then of divine simplicity. The third one is that this guts the argument of its force, and it seems to cut against premise 4 here, because then the naturalist could just say that the naturalistic foundation is limited in boatloads of respects, so long as they say that there are more fundamental aspects of the foundation which are unlimited and which explain those non-fundamental limits. Okay, so that's the problem that the argument seems to pose for Christian theism. But here's the second problem that applies to theism more generally. Okay, so we're still within my fourth response in general, that arguably, like, this argument is just problematic for theism, because God can't, under theism, be unlimited. So that one was specific to Christianity, but here's the subpoint, which is just to theism more generally. So plausibly, God can't be unlimited because his desires and his reasons, they vary in strength. They are in some sense degreed or on a spectrum, and not all of them are maxed out, and of unlimited intensity. If you deny this, well then you gut theism of its explanatory power, like, right, which world among the infinite array of worlds is God to create? Each of them is sufficiently good for God to be able to create them. It's not as though any of them are incompatible with God's existence, so each of them has some degree of goodness, and so God has some degree of desire for actualizing them. But if you're saying that all of God's desires are just like unlimited, like of infinite intensity or whatever, maxed out, well then we become entirely unable to predict which one of these is such that God would actualize. And so we literally wouldn't be able to predict any particular world among the infinite array of possible worlds that we would expect God to actualize. So you're gutting theism of its predictive and explanatory power if you say that all of God's desires and all of his reasons have an unlimited intensity or unlimited strength. Moreover, you're gutting God of his perfect rationality, because surely God has more reason to actualize some things over others, because surely some things are objectively more valuable than others. And so, because God's desires have to track objective values, surely God's going to desire to actualize some things more than others. If he's perfectly rational, of course. And, I mean, if you say that, well, then God would not be perfectly rational, because then God would have an inappropriate and imperfect preference function, which, of course, is a kind of limitation itself. So, either God has limited strengths of reasons and desires or whatever, in which case God is limited, or if he has unlimited strengths of reasons and desires and so on, well, then he has limits in that case. He's still limited, because then he has inappropriate and imperfect preference functions. Now, again, you might respond to this by saying that those desires are non-fundamental, or the strength of those desires is non-fundamental, or those reasons or the strength of those reasons, that's non-fundamental. But again, this response is seriously problematic. You're going to have to say goodbye to the doctrine of divine simplicity, and again, the naturalists can say the exact same thing. So I guess the purpose of my bringing out this point about desires and reasons, or at least the strength of desires and the strength of reasons, or at least the relative weights of reasons, how much they impress God, as it were, my point in bringing that up is just that the problem of divine limitation is not going to be afflicting just Christian theists. It's also going to be afflicting theists more generally. So it seems as though all theists are going to be in this camp here. So anyway, that is my fourth response, is that this argument seems to conflict with God's having to be limited in various ways. What about my fifth response to the argument from limits? Well, I'm going to call this the problem of a limitation. A limitation. Not a limitation in the sense of like atheism, that kind of prefix, but a limitation in the sense of like capital A dash limitation. So it's a specific kind of limitation that I'm going to be explaining in a second. So in light of what we've just said, it seems as though we would have to modify the principle of explanation to saying that every fundamentally limited being is non-circularly explained. That is, has an explanation outside of itself. The relevant explanatory principle can't be that every limited being is non-circularly explained or explained by reference to something outside of itself, because, of course, we've just seen that God is going to have some limits. And, of course, God doesn't have an outside explanation, something outside of him that explains why he exists. So you're going to have to basically modify the principle to saying, okay, God is fundamentally unlimited, and our argument really is every fundamentally limited being is non-circularly explained or externally explained. But here's the problem for that. What I say is that all the same motivations for the principle that fundamentally limited beings are non-circularly explained, hereafter explained, equally apply to the principle that beings with any limits whatsoever are explained. Okay? So call a being with any limit whatsoever an A-limited being. An A-limited being. And call a being with fundamental limits an F-limited being. Okay, so a being with any limit whatsoever, that's an A-limited being, and a being with fundamental limits is an F-limited being. Note, of course, then, that F limitation, being F limited, entails A limitation, or being A limited, but not vice versa, because in principle, again, you could have something that has some limitation or other, but it's not a fundamental limit to it. So, my claim then, which again I offer for the purpose of, serving you guys, not to knock down or build up some sort of tribe, is that the same motivations for the principle adduced in Josh's argument, namely that F-limited things have an explanation, or at least can have an explanation, the same motivations for that principle equally justifies the principle that A-limited things have explanations, or that they can have explanations. So, if we accept the F-limitation principle on the basis of such motivations, it seems we should also accept the A-limitation principle on the basis of such motivations as well. Consider that a combination of both reason and experience attest to the truth of the a-limitation principle, right? From experience, we uniformly and universally witness a-limited things having some explanation. I witness explanations of a-limited things in my own mind when, for example, I form mental images or intentions. And our empirical evidence also attests to it. Science is in the business of discovering all sorts of truths about and explanations of a-limited things, and it has been profoundly successful in this endeavor. And science, of course, is founded on a kind of rational, explainable order. We can also run a modal uniformity argument based on the inductive experience above that I just mentioned. Absent special and sufficiently countervailing reasons, we should think that a-limited things are categorically uniform when it comes to the modal property of explicability. Josh Rasmussen himself has published on this kind of modal uniformity support. What kinds of things, we can ask, moreover, could exist without an explanation? Well, we might say that mere differences in A-limits don't seem relevant to unexplained existence. A-limited things don't seem relevantly different from one another in terms of calling out for some deeper explanation. And finally, our default stance should be that a-limited things are explicable. Explicability, or being able to be explained, is the norm rather than the exception, and so we would need some special reason for making an exception to this rule. These, it seems, are lots of the central motivations that people cite on behalf of the F-limited principle, that every fundamentally limited thing requires some explanation, or at least can have an explanation, and I'm just pointing out here that all of them equally apply to A-limited things, such that they would equally motivate thinking that every A-limited thing has an explanation, or at least can have an explanation. So from this, and from the fact that there are a-limited things, and finally from the fact that explanation here, again, we're taking to be non-circular, or an outside explanation, we can conclude that there is an a-unlimited being. What explains why the fact that there are any a-limited beings at all? Well, it can't be in terms of an a-limited being, because then, of course, we'd have a circular explanation for that. And, of course, per our principle, a-limited beings, whether individually or as a plurality, they require some sort of explanation. And so we can conclude that there is an a-unlimited being that explains why there are a-limited beings. We can conclude that there is, or at least can be, an a-unlimited being that explains why there are the a-limited beings that there are. This a-unlimited being has no limits whatsoever, whether fundamental or non-fundamental. Now we can ask, why does this matter? Well, for starters, it equips us with a new argument against theism and Christianity as well, because we showed earlier that God, after all, is not a-unlimited under both Christianity and theism. God has various limits, albeit non-fundamental limits, but still he has some limits. He's limited in the number of persons in which he exists. The degree or strength of various of his desires and reasons are limited, and so on. So God isn't a-unlimited. So we've basically concluded to an a-unlimited being that explains why there are a-limited things, and God is going to be among those a-limited things. In which case, now we've just gotten to an a-unlimited being, which is the foundation of reality, and that's not God. But of course, if we suppose that God exists, God is supposed to be the foundation of reality, but we've just concluded that the foundation of reality is a-unlimited, and hence not God. And so God isn't the foundation of reality, and because if God exists, again, God is the foundation of reality, it would follow that God doesn't exist. So we have a new argument against God's existence on our hands, arguably. So anyway, that is my fifth response to the argument from limits. It's the problem of a-limitation. And the idea, again, is, in short, that given that God is limited in various respects, basically, they have to modify their principle of explanation. Instead of saying that every limited being has an outside explanation, because that would entail that God has an outside explanation, which is absurd, they have to say every fundamentally limited being has an outside explanation. And that wouldn't entail that God has an outside explanation, because they want to say God is fundamentally unlimited, despite having certain non-fundamental limits. Now, of course, though, once they say that, I say that the exact same motivations for their principle that every fundamentally limited being has an outside explanation would equally justify thinking that every limited being whatsoever, with any limits whatsoever, has an outside explanation, such that, if they affirm the former, it seems as though they should also affirm the latter. But of course, affirming the latter requires denying theism and Christianity itself. So that, in short, is the problem of a-limitation. That is my fifth response. My sixth response to the argument is basically, right, we have to compare the theories, right? So if we compare the theories, so one of the central motivations behind the argument is to explain things as far as we can. But we have to balance this against other theoretical virtues, like how well it explains the data, its qualitative and quantitative and ideological and theoretical simplicity, and so on, and so on. Suppose one view, H, explains things further compared to a rival hypothesis, H star, but H's further explanation isn't all that illuminating, which is explanatory depth, and H also accounts poorly for a lot of the other data, which is explanatory breadth. Suppose also that H is qualitatively, quantitatively, and ideologically, and theoretically more complex than H star. In this case, we should surely accept H star rather than H, even though H explains things further than H star, and we might suppose H star prematurely stops the explanatory buck. So even though H explains things further than H star, and even though H star, we might think, prematurely stops the explanatory buck, we should still accept H star in this situation over H, because it best manages the trade-off among the various theoretical virtues. But given that, what I say is just that even if positing an unlimited being affords us some explanatory payoff in explaining why there are limited beings, we shouldn't be too quick to adopt the principle that whatever is limited has an explanation, because we have to compare the theories, according to one of which whatever is limited has an explanation, and so explains things basically as far as you can. But we have to compare that to another theory which says maybe most limited things have an explanation, and maybe there's a fundamental limited thing that doesn't have an explanation, but perhaps that theory manages the trade-off between explanatory power and theoretical complexity and all those other considerations much better than the former theory. And in that case, we should actually accept the latter theory over the former theory. So it seems. And furthermore, what I say is just that it's not clear whether or not this is the situation that obtains with respect to this argument. To me, it's not clear whether or not naturalism manages those trade-offs better than theism. And that, in turn, I think can serve to undermine this particular argument, and in particular, I've been using it to target premise 1, as I just mentioned. Now, someone might respond to me here by saying that, okay, well, maybe we can just best interpret the argument from limits as saying that all other things being equal, the fact that H explains things further than H star gives an edge to H over H star. Now, I think that seems reasonable, but it just seems to significantly weaken the case for H, as other things are almost certainly never equal. What comes to mind, especially, is how, following Draper from his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on atheism and agnosticism, as well as his discussion with Alex Malpass on Malpass's channel Thoughtology, arguably the view of a thoroughly fundamentally unlimited foundation is far less intrinsically probable than the competing hypothesis that the foundation has some limit or other along some axis or other. Although specifying some particular limit along some particular axis would arguably make the unlimited foundation hypothesis more intrinsically probable than such an alternative, it seems reasonable that the hypothesis on which the foundation has some limit or other along some axis or other far outcompetes the unlimited foundation hypothesis in terms of intrinsic probability. After all, for any property P that something has, there's only one or two ways for that thing to be unlimited with respect to P. Either have P to an infinite extent or maybe infinite magnitude, or else have P in a kind of qualitatively complete and pure way. By contrast, there are, it seems, infinitely many ways to be limited with respect to P. You could have P to this degree, and then a little bit higher, and then a little bit higher, and then a little bit higher, and a little bit higher, and so on. All those ways constitute various ways to be limited with respect to P. So it seems as though the intrinsic probability of having some limit or other along some axis or other is far greater than being thoroughly unlimited along every axis whatsoever, or at least along every fundamental axis whatsoever. And in that case, it's not at all clear to my mind why or how merely explaining, in the present dialectical context at least, one fact further, namely the fact that there are limited things, it's not clear why explaining that one fact further would raise the posterior probability of the unlimited foundation hypothesis enough to counteract that intrinsic probability advantage of the some limit or other foundation hypothesis. And it's also not clear to me how illuminating the explanation proffered by the unlimited foundation is. Presumably the explanation is in terms of a freely willed act of creation. This is its explanation for why there are limited things, or at least fundamentally limited things. But then of course we get into the weeds of the luck objection, rollback arguments, and all sorts of things that render the explanation far less illuminating to my mind than we might have initially thought. At the very least, all these potential issues for the argument concerning intrinsic probability and explanatory power and whatnot are very murky to my mind, which should inspire us, or at least inspire me, to be extremely cautious and hesitant in accepting the argument. So anyway, that's my sixth response. It's about theory comparison. But on to my seventh response to the argument from limits. Now, I'm just going to be very brief with this particular response. The basic idea behind the response is just to appeal to Platonism, and basically it's just saying that plausibly some properties and some propositions exist independently of God and other concreta, and in that case, then plausibly there would be limits fundamental to reality, contra the argument from limits. Again, because propositions are limited in various respects, right? The proposition that 1 + 1 = 2 is limited to being just about the number 1, the plus function, the equals function, and the number 2. It's limited in that way. And if we think that at least some propositions aren't going to have some kind of outside explanation or grounding or whatever, well then arguably we have reason to think that that first premise is false. Whatever's limited has an explanation. No, there are going to be some limited things that don't have an outside explanation. Now, of course, that's going to get us into the debate between theistic conceptualism, Platonism, and so on. But I've already argued, both in this video and elsewhere, that arguably theistic conceptualism is going to face some potentially serious problems with respect to abstracta. I suppose you could then respond by saying, oh, well, I'm just going to restrict my first premise to saying whatever concrete that's limited has an explanation. Okay, I guess you could do that. But then my question would be, given that we have good reason to think that some limits are indeed fundamental and don't have a further explanation, albeit abstract limits, why think that there couldn't be concrete limits that similarly are fundamental, that don't have a further outside explanation? So even if you restricted the scope of that first premise, we would still seem to have an undercutting defeater on our hands, because, again, there would be nothing inherently problematic about limits as such being fundamental. We would need some further reason as to why concrete limits are relevantly different from abstract limits with respect to the ability to be fundamental. Yes, I know, much more can be said both back and forth on these matters, and for every single objection that I leveled, much more can be and has been said back and forth on these various considerations, especially between me and Josh in private conversation over the years. So anyway, if Josh is listening to this, I want to express my utmost gratitude to him for all of his thoughts and serving me throughout all these years, all these various email correspondences and so on. I've learned and grown so much by interacting with Josh, and I don't at all mean to imply or suggest or even intimate that the considerations that I've leveled here are insuperable or knocked down, or that Josh doesn't have responses to them, or that Josh can't respond to them, or whatever. I know Josh has various considerations to say in response. I, in turn, have various considerations to say in response to what he has to say, and so on and so on and so on and so on, and back and forth, perhaps throughout endless eternity.